What you are about to witness is a fascinating interview with a gentleman called Christopher Spencer, or rather that is his pen name. He has to conceal his real name. In the following interview, Christopher speaks about his 50 plus years in the world of high-level finance, both as a banker and a finance and investment broker. He covers everything from international espionage to covert financial agreements, conmen, murder, war, and more, with a touch of personal flair. Everything you are about to hear is true. Some questions were pre-agreed and scripted to explain specific content in his books. Most are not. You can find details of where to buy his books in the video description below. This is part 8. What comes out to me is that this world of international construction is a very corrupt world. Government ministers and officials were bribed and often allowed these large construction companies to get away with things not in the interest of their countries. Does this still go on?
Yes, I'm afraid it does. I mean, corruption is rampant in many countries. I'm afraid even in the UK there is corruption, but it's just so well hidden that one can't fathom it. What happens, of course, is that not only government officials, but ministers want to be looked after in order to award you projects. And certainly in the 1980s, when I was in the construction sector, this was well accepted. The problem is, of course, that our competitors were always willing to pay bribes. I'll use the word bribes advisedly. And therefore, if we wanted to win the contract, we had to cooperate with that situation. The Americans, of course, had legislation already against bribery and corruption, but American companies just found a different way of doing it, a more hidden way of doing it, and carried on. Otherwise, they would not have won any projects at all for America. Other countries were very capable of this kind of operation as well, and the communist world at that stage in the 1980s had no problems with this at all. Since then, legislation has been introduced here in the UK and in other countries against bribery and corruption. That works for a while, but every so often you'll find there are newspaper reports of big companies being charged with corruption and offering bribes to overseas officials. And they usually come to an agreement with the government that their government, that they will pay a big fine, and they pay it, and then everything carries on as normal. So it's very, very difficult to eradicate this situation. For countries like Russia, for example, or China, or other countries, they have no problem with this. They just bring in large cases full of US dollar bills, high denominational US dollar bills, and pay for it. I mean, this is what the Chinese do in Africa. They couldn't have got their position in Africa that they've got now, controlling various African governments without bribing the ministers and the officials. They have no problem with that bribery. They just bring in cases full of money and distribute it in order to get the influence and the projects that they want to get.
Yeah, corruption now.
That won't go down very well in Beijing, but it's true.
Your next story is about Africa. You don't name the African country or the politician, but what is clear is that he was amazingly corrupt. Why were you still happy to deal with this man?
Well, I first met him through, I'll call him his business agent, if you like. Politicians of that kind of level obviously have various advisors assisting them. And I met this man. He was very persuasive, very charming. I met him quite a few times in London and out in the particular African country concerned. It was only later on that, of course, he raised this question, well, if you want projects, you will have to, make some payments to my boss, and obviously he would have his percentage of it as well. By that time, I was rather keen on developing the situation. So, but I then had a moral dilemma. Would I go on with trying to develop this scene, or would I not? And I came to the decision, well, all I can do is to advise the various companies that might be interested in doing business there, that this was the situation, and this was a decision, therefore, that they had to make. I avoided it in the end, I suppose, because he was the vice president of the country concerned at that time, and then he was fired by the president for corruption. But such was the nature of the country that he was eventually reinstated, and then he became the president of the country himself. And of course, when he got into that position, this politician who I entertained in London, this politician ripped his country off, stole large sums of money overseas, and I'm pleased to say is now on trial for corruption. I hope that he will get a long prison sentence in a local jail, which will not be very pleasant. I'm afraid to say local jails there are not pleasant at all.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. Your last story really shocked me. It appears that there was an opportunity to stop Osama bin Laden before he went on to plan and carry out the bombing of the American embassies in 2 African countries. Even more, the event that marked the turn of the century, the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York in 2001, could have also been stopped. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, I was introduced to a gentleman, a journalist, by a long-standing friend who knew I had some connections with the intelligence services. And this gentleman, the journalist, made an offer, which I then had to take to the intelligence services through a close colleague who was himself a senior serving intelligence officer. We tried very, very hard because the suggestion was that Osama bin Laden could have been stopped in his tracks. But unfortunately, for one reason or another, that offer was not taken up. And you will remember then that about a year or so later, there were 2 American embassies bombed in 2 African capitals, Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Many Americans were killed. There was then the attack on the USS Cole in the Red Sea. And then, of course, 9/11 came along with the loss of life and the destruction of property that occurred then. Now, when you go through something like this, it really haunts you. You think, well, why didn't this happen? Could I have done something different? Why didn't people sit up and take notice and do something about it? And I've kind of carried out an investigation, really, of why this might not have been taken up. And I've read lots of books about 9/11. I read a very good book about the connection between the CIA and the ISS, which is the Pakistani intelligence service. I read books about the relationship between the Americans and Saudi Arabia. And I came to the conclusion that we were just too early. This approach was too early because the Americans were watching Osama bin Laden very carefully, but they had not yet come to the conclusion that he was a clear and present danger to the West. Certainly, the British Secret Intelligence Service would have asked the CIA, the Americans, what they thought about this offer. I've got no doubt about that, because they work very closely together. And the reply probably would have come back from the Americans, well, we're looking at this man, but we're not yet convinced. And so the British would have then decided not to have taken up the offer that was made. It was unfortunate, but intelligence is not a perfect art. Spies, intelligence agents, intelligence officials are human beings. They make mistakes. There is prejudice in intelligence very often. There's not complete intelligence. And so we have to be very careful in dealing with matters like this, that all the information is checked and rechecked. And of course, you get collateral, that is, independent sources that come in as well with the same opinion as the original source, thereby confirming that the information that you have been given is true and accurate. This was not done in certain circumstances. One, of course, was the Iraqi war, when it was alleged that Saddam Hussein had all these chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction, which proved to be inaccurate. And there have been other cases of this happening